This video is about life after GP training, making choices in sessional GP work, and it's part of a training session for final year GP registrars, but it focuses particularly on locum working, the challenges, opportunities, practicalities and choices. This topic map highlights all the topics that are covered in that training session, and in particular the ones covered in this video, which are the areas highlighted in blue. So the practicalities of locum work, invoicing, booking, software, terms and conditions, self-employed tax, clinical risk, induction and preparation, and so on, and also the locum options such as freelance, chambers, agency, or working through a web platform. The other parts you can see on this topic plan are available in the other videos of this series. Locum work has, like many things, its upsides and its downsides. So on the upsides, it's known to be the best option for controlling your workload and for determining your weekly hours. It offers flexibility over holidays, not just the timing but the duration, so it's flexible to fit in long periods of travel or voluntary work overseas. It also allows juggling with other portfolios and with dependents that you may care for, and the opportunity to try out different practices. The downsides, however, include isolation, financial insecurity and no sick pay, exposure if there are complaints, particularly to the GMC, complex administration involving tax and superannuation, limited access to education and difficulties accessing NHS net email, higher indemnity, no appraisal funding. Appraisal can be more challenging. You're often underrepresented and there is no death in service benefits. So let's look at the nuts and bolts of getting set up as a locum. These are the four areas that I'll cover. So for tax, you want to make sure you record all your income and expenses, get an accountant, and use some kind of software or platform to keep track of all those numbers and activity. From an indemnity point of view, you need to make sure that you inform your medical defence organisation of the types of work and the amount of each kind of work you'll be doing. You'll need to have a variety of documents ready to present to each of your prospective employers, and this includes your CCT and evidence of inclusion on the medical performers list. Also includes proof of indemnity and GMC registration, and your DBS criminal record check, a proof of identity such as passport and your CV. Finally, some practices also expect to see proof of immunisations, safeguarding and CPR training. From an administration point of view, you may want to get some invoicing software that automatically generates invoices and superannuation forms, and you may also want to use a variety of different platforms or networks to find work, and this is covered in another slide. Some basic points about getting organised for tax includes keeping a record of your professional income. So this may be your P60s for employed roles and a locum spreadsheet for all your self-employed work and other fee-based work. And then keeping a record of your expenses, which will include professional subscriptions and course fees, mileage, equipment, office costs and software, and of course your superannuation contributions for locum work. Some top tips regarding all this are to put money aside regularly right from the outset, use an accountant, consider using some kind of locum software to keep tabs on bookings and invoices, and finally, don't leave your tax return to the last minute. So in terms of finding work, you need to be aware of the different ways in which you can do this. In the North East, there's the North East Sessional GP group and also Facebook First RCGP page. There are also Federation Locum Banks. Online platforms include Locum Deck and Lantum, and there's also the GP magazines such as Pulse and GP. There are agencies, federations and out-of-hours organisations, and then there are chambers, which includes Pallant Chamber and the North East Medical Chambers. When you work as a locum, you need to be familiar with the pension form GP Locum A and GP Locum B, and we'll explain a bit more about these as we go along. They can be obtained from the Pensions Agency website, where all the guidance is also available. If you're working as a locum, you'll need to submit a Locum Form B for each of the months in which you work, and attached to that Form B you'll need to submit a Form A for each of the practices that you've worked in that month. The next slide explains a little bit more about these forms and what you put on them. So when you set your locum fee, 90% of that fee is superannuable. That means that your superannuation payment is calculated on the basis of 90% of the fee. And the employee superannuation obviously depends on the tier that you've selected, explained earlier on your expected annual income. And the employer superannuation is set for everybody at 14.38%. Your invoice will include not just the fee that you're charging the practice, but also the employer's portion of the superannuation. Your payment to the NHS Pensions Agency via Capita will include your employee's superannuation part and the employer's superannuation part, and it's recommended that this is done by BACS to NHS England using a reference number which is made up of your pension reference number, which has 8 digits, followed by LOC for locum, 3 letters of the month, and then 2 letters of the year that you're in. It's very important that you use this reference so that it allows your BACS payment to be linked up with the forms A and B. Once you've made the payment, it's important to then send the proof of BACS payment, the Form B and the Form A, and email all of those to Capita by the 7th of the month. That's the email address. Capita then submits those payments to the NHS Pensions within 10 weeks. Important tips here are to keep email receipts of your emails to Capita, and also to remember to request a pensions record annually from the NHS Pensions Agency to make sure that your superannuation is reaching your personal pension record. You will need to have an understanding, even as a locum, about how the pension scheme operates, because the likelihood is you will be working in several roles, and some of those will fall into practitioner and some into officer income. This is all explained in my other video about life after the VTS. It also covers aspects of making sure that you've paid at the right level and the form you need to complete at the end of each year, which is the Type 2 practitioner form, and explains what a Type 2 practitioner is. It's worth being aware of the tools that are available to you to manage your locum work, from basic to intermediate to more premium type tools. So at a basic level, these software-based or web-based tools will create invoices and superannuation forms. At the next level up, there's often space for you to put your certificates so they can be accessed directly by practices. There's often somewhere where you can upload your online calendar of availability, and that may be visible to practices. And as well as generating invoices and superannuation forms, the platform may be able to actually send those directly to practices rather than you having to attach them separately to an email. These type of platforms usually require a monthly fee, usually a fixed fee. At the next level up, you may have a platform where not only you can put your availability online, but practices can book it directly. And for this level of support, which includes all of the facilities in the types above, there's usually a fee payable which may be a percentage of your earnings. Currently there are various ways to work as a locum, and the choice between them will depend on what's most important to you, whether it's autonomy, having support for education and appraisal, having peer and admin support, and the professional and financial risk. So the options include working entirely freelance, working through an agency, working through a chambers, or working through some kind of web-based platform. And the next slides will explain a little bit about the different options. There are trade-offs in the choices of working as a locum versus working as a salaried doctor. So the highest autonomy and control is often correlated with the lowest degree of financial security and support, and with the highest degree of exposure to complaints, particularly GMC complaints. So a salaried GP may be working at the end with the most support but the least autonomy, whereas a freelance GP is working at the other end. A chambers locum is working somewhere more near the middle, insofar as they can decide still what days they work on, how many sessions a week they work, which practices they work in, but they're often working from a predetermined menu of session types from which they can decide what kinds of session they want to work. They are also committed to attending chambers meetings to participate in peer review and education. So let's look at the benefits of working through a chambers. The benefits for practices include the fact that the chambers recruitment process provides quality assurance about the locum, as they've interviewed the locum and checked their references and so on. The chambers can provide all the necessary documents that the practice needs, act as a single point of contact for contacting several locums, and may be able to provide a substitute if the locum is ill. In addition, there are often very clear terms of engagement for locums working through chambers, so less chance of confusion or misunderstandings. And finally, chambers have a process for handling significant events as part of a peer support and professional development process, and so practices can contact the chambers to highlight when significant events have occurred. In terms of benefits for locums, there's help with all the administrative side of handling bookings, filling the calendar, invoicing and superannuation forms, having again clear terms and fees, which helps the locum and removes that negotiation side of things, producing pension forms, provision of education and peer support, help with appraisal, audit and SEA, an advocacy role. The chambers ensures that appropriate induction and logins are provided, and also chases late payments and cancellation fees. So let's compare the different options according to the degree of admin support, autonomy and cost to the locum. So if you work entirely freelance, there's usually no admin support at all, but you have complete autonomy, and there's no cost over and above your professional subscriptions, mileage and so on. However, if you work through a web-based platform, there's usually some automation of the admin side, but it's not complete, and there's quite a lot of autonomy, but some of your terms and conditions are set by the platform. Usually there's a fee that the web platform obtains, but it may be either charged to the practice or to the locum, and that changes significantly the nature of the experience from the locum's point of view. If you work through an agency, again, there's usually some admin support in that the agency may invoice the practice for you and sort out the bookings, and again you have more autonomy, slightly less autonomy than a freelancer because terms and conditions are set by the agency, and there is usually no cost to the locum. The fee is charged to practices. And then if you work through chambers, there's excellent admin support, both with bookings, paperwork, chasing invoicing and superannuation. You have a high level of autonomy, but not as much as a freelancer, as the terms and conditions are set partly by chambers, although you can choose the type of menu, type of session within a menu you do. And there's usually a fee to the locum, which is a percentage of the income from the locum fee. If we compare these options from the point of view of peer support, education, appraisal and support with GMC complaints, you're the most exposed if you're freelance working through a web platform or an agency, but you have significant protection and support in those areas if you work through a chambers. So why should you define your workload as a GP locum? Well, there are a couple of groups of reasons, one clinical and one professional. Under the clinical, the GMC states that you should work within the limits of your competence, and I think that means not just your skill set, but the limits of your ability to handle different amounts of workload. Secondly, working within defined limits of workload is likely to be associated with less errors, complaints and litigation. And thirdly, Working in an unfamiliar environment places particular challenges on timekeeping and on running to time. From a professional point of view, you want to be clear what you're going to deliver so that there are no surprises either for you or for the practice. Secondly, you want to be sure that you arrive on time at your afternoon surgery if that's different to the morning, or that you arrive on time at any later commitment you may have. And finally, you need to remember that you're self-employed, and this means that you decide what, how, where and when you do the work that you do, and this is explored further in the next slide. So to explore this issue between self-employed and employed a bit further, a self-employed person decides what work they do and when, where or how to do it. They're not under direct supervision. In contrast, an employed person has a manager or supervisor who's responsible for their workload, saying when a piece of work should be finished and how it should be done. And it's important to remember that there are advantages to the practice as well as the locum in the fact that the GP locum is self-employed. So let's look at how you might define your work as a GP locum to be safe. I think it's useful to think of this in terms of core plus extras using this traffic light diagram, with the green bit being the core bit which is included in your standard fee. And this includes things like a set number of appointments and visits, your own prescriptions and your own investigations and referral letters arising from this caseload. The amber zone is your maybe zone. These are discretionary items of work which you may do depending on the surgery or depending on circumstances and may be subject to an extra fee. And this might include extras, repeat prescriptions, on-call, telephone triage and visits. The red zone is what you might call your never zone, and this might include things like handling letters and results of others, doing private work, and supervision of registrars, nurses and nurse practitioners. But the division between these three areas is entirely personal. The principle is that as you move from your core work to what you consider discretionary, you might charge an additional fee, and it might be subject to your agreement on the day, depending on time. There are often things for which it's difficult to estimate the time. So when setting your terms of service, you want to specify your fees according to the session type, and usually sessions are defined by workload, not just duration. You may want to specify fees for extras such as extra appointments, visits or on-call duties, and also an hourly rate for overrunning, for example if the computer is down or there's delay in providing you with logins. Additionally, you may want to specify what kind of administration you'll be doing, whether you'll be doing only your own letters and lab results or whether you'll be doing those of others. You'll need to specify whether you'll be doing repeat prescriptions, your cancellation terms, so the fee that you'll charge if the practice no longer needs you and cancels your session at short notice, what kind of appointments you want to be booked as double appointments, for example if you need interpreters. You want to specify the induction information that you'd like to be provided with, and the logins you want to be provided with, for example for clinical systems and test requesting systems. There are a number of examples of terms and conditions available on the web, including the National Association of Sessional GPs and also the North East Sessional GP Group website. For longer term locums, there are some additional things you need to think about. For example, over a 6-month period you may well take some holiday, so it's worth agreeing in advance how much holiday you intend to take. As a self-employed contractor, it's up to you when you take it, but it is helpful to agree how much notice you'll provide for the holiday. You may want to specify whether you'll be participating on the on-call rota, and if so, with what frequency and how much you'll charge when you're on call. You may want to ask to have access to practice meetings, to be part of the team, to have a regular room, and you may also want to negotiate some additional time for administration as there's likely to be more paperwork involved, and so in some cases you may want to reduce your overall number of appointments offered to allow more time for paperwork. You need to remember that if you're doing a longer term locum for more than 6 months, this is type 2 practitioner work and has an effect on your superannuation paperwork. Signing of repeat prescriptions can be an area for misunderstanding between locums and practices. We surveyed locums in the North East to ask them about their custom and practice and found that there was a difference between short and long-term placements. insofar as those working in short-term placements were much less likely to sign repeat prescriptions than those working in longer-term placements, where they could be familiar with the safety of practice systems and the medication review systems. This is in keeping with guidance from the medical defence organisations. There are certain things that are worth considering when you're taking on locum work in places that you don't know. So for example, you want to be very careful that you don't cancel locums or double book yourself, as reliability is very important to your reputation and your professionalism as a locum. It's also important not to have unclear terms, because these can lead to misunderstandings. For some locums, it may be better to avoid single-handed practices, as you will be left with providing all the prescriptions, doing all the on-call, and occasionally being involved in reciprocal arrangements with other single-handed practices and covering more than one practice. There is often no support from another clinician. You want to avoid working in a practice where you're unfamiliar with the IT systems, and also perhaps avoiding practices that have a poor reputation, either because their doctors are under investigation by the GMC or they've had a poor CQC rating. Remember that you're very exposed as a locum, so working in a practice with poor systems increases your exposure even more. Things that were highlighted when we surveyed some of the locums in the northeast were that they tended to avoid practices with very demanding patients or unfriendly practices where the on-call was expected. They also tended to avoid practices where there was no proper dictation equipment, where you had to type your own letters or you had to do your own choose and book administration. They also reported avoiding practices where there were referral management systems, where you had to discuss all your referrals. Finally, there were some that commented that they avoided surgeries that were entirely telephone triage based. So this slide illustrates how you set your locum fee based on a worked example, using the NASGP and BMA fee calculator. So if we pick a arbitrary annual income that you feel that you're personally worth and equate that to 9 sessions per week, you need to add on a percentage for expenses that you think you'll incur, and that will include things like GMC, medical indemnity, travel and so on. And then working out your daily sessional fee rate will depend on a number of factors. So for example, if you say you're going to take 6 weeks annual leave and bank holidays, the calculation will be different than if you're going to also build in some time for continuing professional development, for example 2 weeks, as of course you still need to meet the requirements of appraisal in your time, and there's no provision to claim an appraisal fee, so that needs to be reflected. The time spent on CPD and appraisal needs to be reflected in your fee. You may decide that you want to reflect the same amount of CPD that a salaried GP would be entitled to, or 1 session per week, in which case the calculation will be different again. So it's possible to use a fee calculator to work out what your sessional fee would be in all of these situations, but remember that you'll always need to include on top of that the employer's superannuation. If you start off at a different starting annual income that you think you're worth, then of course you're going to arrive at different sessional rates again. One thing that we're asked a lot by GPs working as locums is, when does a long-term locum make you an employee? And this is quite a complex area, and it's worth referring to guidance on both the BMA website and the NASGP website. But there are 3 angles on this. One is the point of view of HMRC, or the tax angle. The second one is the angle of your employment rights, for example the right to sick leave, paid annual leave and so on. And the third is the pensions or superannuation angle. From a tax point of view, there's plenty of guidance on the HMRC website that you're self-employed if you can make a profit or a loss, you have a contract for services, take unpaid leave, you set your own fees and invoice for work, you decide how much, when and how to work, you might work for multiple businesses, and you provide your own equipment and have the right of substitution. From an employment rights point of view, usually being employed means that you've got the right to statutory pay, such as sick and maternity pay. There's a notice period, there's the rights to unfair dismissal, and also redundancy payment, and the right to flexible working. The pension angle is that if you're working for more than 6 months in a post, you become a type 2 practitioner and you can't use locum form A and B. You have to use a solo form, and 100% of the fee is superannuable, superannuation being deducted by the practice. However, the other option is that you work using a form A and B, but you don't pension the 7th month of the work in that practice. The issue of employment status comes up a lot amongst locums, particularly doing long-term work, and so I thought I would just summarise here some key points from the website of the Inland Revenue. You can pause the video if you want to read these. We surveyed locums in the northeast of England to ask them about the factors which influence their choice of practice, and we found that by far the most important was the fact that practice respects the workload they've agreed to do. And given that people choose to do locum work in order to have control over workload, that makes sense. Other factors that determined their preference for practice are listed here, and you can see their order of priority. It's really important when you start out as a locum to make sure that you're prepared and organised, and this can be looked at in 3 steps. So what you need to do at booking, on arrival and on leaving. So at booking, you're looking at confirming your workload and fee, making sure that you request a personal login, informing the practice about your smart card, asking to have access to the test requesting system or ICE, and just clarifying whether there's any help with choose and book or whether you're required to do those yourself. You also ask about a locum induction file and parking, make sure you provide all the documents a practice needs, and you might want to ask whether there's dictation support. When you arrive, you want to make sure you get your logins, get access to all the telephone numbers, find out who's on call, how to obtain a chaperone, how the dictation works, where all the referral forms are in the secretary, where emergency drugs are and defibrillator, and who to give your superannuation forms and your invoice to. And then on leaving, making sure that you cover handovers, finish any referrals, sort out superannuation form and invoices, and are clear between you and the practice about handling any feedback or complaints. When you work as a locum, locum induction is really important, and this includes the domains of induction to the room, the practice team, the building, and the community and hospital, and also IT. So from this point of view, it's making sure that you've informed them about your smart card and they've got it registered to the practice, that you've got a login to the computer clinical system and also to the testing system. You may want to log into the intranet system where all the guidelines and referral forms are, and you may need a login to the digital dictation system. The other important domains of practice induction include the room, so making sure it's fully stocked and you've got the telephone list, you know where the panic button is, the dictaphone, how to call patients in, and you know where to find everything. In terms of the practice teams, knowing how to request common things, what the nurses around you are prepared to do, the chaperone and on-call system, how to message doctors, where to access secretarial and admin support, how to report significant events, and how repeat prescribing systems work. And this should all be in the induction folder. The community and hospital side of things includes knowing about referral guidelines and local services, safeguarding and palliative care, ambulatory care and admission avoidance options, and the CCG intranet. And finally, orientation to the building is about knowing where the defibrillator and drugs are, fire exits, toilets, whether you need a swipe card, when the building's closed, and any restrictions on parking. I hope you found this video useful. Please remember it's part of a series of videos that I've created for newly qualified GPs, and the other videos in this series cover salaried options, and also there's a generic video about a range of issues like indemnity, support, superannuation, and so on. Do get in touch if you have feedback you'd like to share, and please feel free to share this video with your colleagues.